Everybody, thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, so a note to our internet audience watching at home. If you're interested in tonight's book, we could ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Just call the number on your screen. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back our friend, Ms. Chantel Acevedo, presenting her new novel, The Distant Marvels. And here to introduce Chantel, please welcome to the podium another good friend of Books and Books. She is the director of the Creative Writing Program at the University of Miami, Ms. Evelina Galang.
Thank you, Victor. Good evening, everyone. So, when I first became the director of the MFA Creative Writing Program at the University of Miami 5 years ago, I set out to honor the founder of that program, Professor Lester Gorin, a fiction writer and teacher who had at that time been teaching 50 years. He would not let me roast him, but he did give me a list of his amazing students who left the program with his blessing and began their writing careers out there in the big wide world. Among his cherished former students was Chantel Acevedo, his pride and joy, who I believe he convinced that life as a teacher was only the first of her many great talents. A hurricane through and through, she graduated not only from the undergraduate program at UM, but our MFA in creative writing. And tonight she comes home an accomplished writer, a tenured professor, and still among the most beloved graduates in our program. Chantel Acevedo is currently an associate professor and alumni writer in residence at Auburn University, where she also serves as the program coordinator for the creative writing program, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. Chantel has published poetry and short stories in journals like Prairie Schooner, the Chattahoochee Review, American Poetry Review, North American Review, Wraparound South, and Wise Latinas, an anthology out of the University of Nebraska. Her first novel, which I believe many in here have read, Love and Ghost Letters from St. Martin's Press, came out in 2005 and won the Latino International Book Award for Best Historical Fiction. Her second novel, A Falling Star, was the winner of the Doris Bachwin Award in 2013 and was published by Carolina Wren Press and is Las Comadres Book Club pick, which is amazing. And her third novel, the novel which we launched tonight here in Miami, The Distant Marvels, gives readers an unconventional glimpse into the battles and reconcentration camps of Cuba's Third War of Independence. Wartime Cuba is evoked through the female protagonist's unique perspective in chapters that move back and forth in time, from the war era to the 1960s and the heady days of the Cuban Revolution. Of the novel, book critic Mark Levine writes, "This extraordinary narrative tells from these women's perspectives how war brings lovers together and tears families apart. This is a major, uniquely powerful, and startlingly beautiful novel that should bring Acevedo's name to the top echelon of this generation's writers." Is that amazing or what? Please welcome our beloved Chantel Acevedo.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Evelina, for maybe the most amazing introduction anyone has ever gotten, ever. And you all should know that Evelina is part of this incredible vanguard of literary artists here in Miami, and this amazing sort of literary scene that's burgeoning here in the city, and she's part of that. So I'm grateful to her for all she's done for arts and letters in my hometown, this beautiful city. So thank you all for being here. I think what we'll do today is talk a little bit about this new novel. I'll tell you where the idea came from, explain the structure of it a little bit, read some, talk some, and then maybe answer some questions if you have them. So I hope you have them. And again, thank you for being here. And also thanks to Books and Books, which is such an extraordinary store, sort of nationally known. And I am so grateful that they keep inviting me to come. So hopefully that will continue to happen. So The Distant Marvels, as you heard, is set both in the 19th century with the backdrop of the Cuban War of Independence from Spain, and also the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. So when the novel opens, it's 1963, and the protagonist, her name is Maria Sirena, is an octogenarian, and a hurricane is lashing the island. And it's a historical hurricane, Hurricane Flora, which was a devastating storm. And so she is taken to shelter in a place in Santiago de Cuba. It's the oldest home on the island. It's called Casa Velázquez, and it was the old governor's mansion. And so she and a bunch of other elderly women shelter during the storm, and to provide them with some comfort and also to sort of relieve herself of a secret she's kept hidden for many years, she tells them stories of her childhood as the daughter of revolutionaries from that first revolution. It's a really interesting era for me. I came onto it because I realized that even though I'm Cuban American, I did not know anything about the war against Spain. I knew the American side of the story. I knew about the Rough Riders and Teddy Roosevelt and what McKinley called the splendid little war, because for them it was a 4-month engagement. And then things were wrapped up quite quickly. But for the Cubans, it was nearly a 3-decade-long struggle, and it was something I didn't know about. And so I started with just some research. I did not plan on writing a book about this. I just wanted to know more about my own heritage. And I learned about the reconcentration camps on the island, which actually inspired in part Adolf Hitler when he designed his own concentration camps. So some of that, so that sort of horrific idea actually began in Spain and began in Cuba. And so the photographs, and you can Google them, are quite awful, and they're of skeletal children and people who were trapped within villages and starved by the Spanish. And sort of the big villain of the story is General Valeriano Weyler, who was called the Butcher. And so he also plays a role in the novel. And when I was looking for these pictures, I found a lot of articles written in the United States, and it was the height of yellow journalism here too. It was the era of Nellie Bly and these sort of journalists who made their names on sort of the backs of this war in Cuba. And one of the articles I found was just really caught my eye. And so it tells the story of a little boy, a reconcentrado boy, who is adopted, sort of, more like sold, to an American captain. And so this captain tells the story of finding this boy after the Battle of San Juan Hill and purchasing him for some money and bringing him home so that he might become the mascot of the Manhattan Club. And the child had a real name, but he renamed him 4th of Wilson because Wilson was his last name and it was the 4th of July. And so I was fascinated by this idea of this boy, a black Cuban boy, who was basically sold to an American soldier. I started to look for him. I looked in archives. I looked in the Manhattan Club minutes. I couldn't find him. History had swallowed him up. And so what does a writer do? Well, then, if I can't find the answer, I'm making it up, you know? And I'm going to rescue him from the maws of time. And so that character became Mario, or Mayito, in my story. And so I tried to sort of reclaim him and his mother. And so the first bit I'm going to read is the very opening of the novel, and Maria Sirena now is in her 80s, and something very sort of shocking arrives in the mail, and that's how the story gets going, okay? So, an unexpected envelope was delivered to me 2 months ago on the first day of August. The package it came in bore the address of the University of Havana, Department of History, in blue ink and a symmetrical print. My name was written in a different hand, and my address in yet another, as if the package had passed from person to person, each contributing some element to its outward appearance. Unnerved by all of those invisible hands, I left the package untouched all afternoon. But I could feel its presence, like fingers reaching into my purse or trying to lift my skirt slowly. Accustomed to being alone, I began to feel that the package was an intrusion, and I could no longer stand it. So I opened it. Inside there was a pair of letters. The first, new and crisp, the blue ink rubbing off on my fingers, explained the second, which was old and crumbling. Maria Sirena, it began, casually, impertinently, as if I were an old friend. We believe this letter belongs to you. It has been housed in our archives, unopened, for many decades. The letter, it was explained, was waylaid somehow at the turn of the century, had turned up in a collection of war-era correspondences sold at auction, and had been acquired by an alumnus of the university. An ingenious student, they wrote, had tracked me down as part of his thesis, and on it went, describing the historical effort to preserve what was most important and find homes for the insignificant. With one glance at the faded postal stamps, my heart began to pound. I worked the brittle flap open, chips of paper falling like confetti. I pulled out an article from an American newspaper, so fragile that tiny parts of the paper crumbled to dust, etching out words and individual letters as if the thing were censoring itself before my eyes. Another page, this one made of onion skin, upon which a Spanish translation of the article had been written in delicate, old-fashioned penmanship, held my attention for a moment, until a small square of stiff paper fluttered to the floor from within the envelope. I bent down and saw that it was a picture of my little boy. My hands, holding the envelope and pages, curled into question marks. And then all of the contents of the package, those unwanted, insignificant things to the historians at the university, slipped to the floor. That day, I sat on the floor and read the article again and again. I put the picture in my bra close to my skin until a corner of it bent. Then I wept for that small damage, one deep enough. I could not undo the crease, but I found a frame for the picture, one deep enough to contain not only the photo, but also the article and its translation. I whispered the diminutive of his name, the only name I ever spoke to him, Mayito, and wondered at the way the envelope had found its way to my sea and my little cottage by the sea. So that's how the story opens. And we soon find out that a hurricane is coming. And she is, again, sort of forced to shelter with these other elderly women. I was really interested in making it a story about women, both in the 1960s era and also at the turn of the century during the War of Independence. Women were crucial to that fight. And I've been very fortunate to have some really wonderful women in my life who have been role models to me, and I've dedicated the book to my mother and grandmother, and also to my aunts, and I've been very fortunate to have them in my life. And so I wanted to read a scene where some of these older women are sheltering, and they're terrified because the flood waters are rising. And if you've ever spent a long time, or any time at all, with a group of Cuban women of a certain age, they are a trip. And while chaos is reigning here, these women sort of are going to have all their personalities. And there's going to be a lot of names here. And again, if you live in Miami, these are names women of a certain generation have, like Mireya and Noraida and Rosalia and Celia, names like that. And so it was a lot of fun thinking of 7 women's names too, and having their voices come in. Okay, so we're going to hear a little bit about what it's like to shelter in Casa Velázquez. Ay, Mireya cries out suddenly, breaking through the buzz, because they've been talking. Miren, she says, tapping her finger against the lower left corner of the window. Susana and I hurry towards the group and see a flash of red in the water below. It is Noraida, swimming in the debris-filled water, her brightly dyed hair like streamers in her wake. We watch as she pushes aside a plastic cup, a sheet of plywood, an umbrella floating upside down and bobbing along. Noraida is a fine swimmer, and every so often she does something with her legs to lift her out of the water up to her waist. She scans the horizon, then dips down again, stroke after stroke, taking her away from Casa Velázquez. We watch as she swims into a sheet of plastic, invisible in the water like a jellyfish. Watch as it wraps around her face and she fights it, ripping the plastic away at last and beating against the water with her long arms. I can't look anymore, Estrella says, and sits on the bed. Ay, que estúpida, says Dulce, and a few of the women nod in agreement. We watch Noraida until she's only a speck of red in the distance. She swims up a side street, sticking close to an apartment building. On the balconies, people wave at her. She rests for a moment on the roof of a huge truck, running her hands over her face and neck. She's stuck, Dulce says. She looks like an island out there, Mireya whispers, but Noraida kicks out once more, slipping into the water. She waves back at the onlookers and swims on, disappearing from our view. Por Dios, I hope she doesn't drown, Mireya says solemnly. We are still by the window, watching the swamped world come to life bit by bit. Every once in a while, a person floats by on a raft. I wonder whether the owners were planning on taking to sea, leaving Cuba on their own terms, visas and government permissions be damned. Overhead, the fat black clouds roil away quickly, headed to some other place in the Caribbean. The sun is peeking out of the east dimly. I'm reminded of something my mother used to say, that should I ever feel afraid for my mortality, I should look up and remember that the sun, vast as it is dying too. None of us are alone in death, she'd said to me, even as her own light was extinguishing. Where she picked up that information, I could not guess. My mother knew a great deal somehow, especially how to charm others into giving her what she wanted. What I wanted at that moment, or what I want at that moment, is an audience. There's another story that's come to mind about my mother and her gifts. I want to tell it so badly and preserve it in the memories of these women that my skin itches. I clear my throat. Perdón, I say, and they turn to look at me. I have a proposition for you, a way of passing the time and helping a sick woman. I mean myself. I'm not well, not long for this world. I want to tell you my story, the story of my life. We all want our stories told, Mireya says with a nervous laugh. Vamos, who else has a story to tell? Rosalia starts looking through her purse while Estrella picks at her nails. Beyond this room, those taking shelter in upper stories of homes all over Santiago de Cuba are wondering when the waters will recede. The drowned are beginning to wash up against buildings, bumping lifelessly against coral walls. Beyond Santiago, out to sea, other islands are in the path of the storm, and people are nailing up thin sheets of plywood over windows and praying to God. Out past the Caribbean, our stories are short clips on the radio and television, reduced to a few seconds of information. Our lives are diminishing ripples in vast waters. I catch my reflection in the window and it startles me. I don't look much like myself. I test it, purse my lips, and watch my reflection do the same, but still, I do not recognize the gesture. Perhaps I am looking at another me, a doppelganger, come to prod me into telling them all of it, even the stories I kept to myself. A deep crack resounds throughout the house in that moment, as if a beam somewhere has given away. "Aye!" a few of the women shout. I sit very still, bracing for a collapse, but none comes. Mireya eyes the ceiling fearfully, her purse clutched to her chest. "The roof is going to come crashing down on us. I know it," she says. "Don't be so negative," I tell her. "Aren't you afraid?" Mireya asks. It's the first honest question she's asked me. I see a glimpse of my old friend in her look. "I'll tell you about fear," I say, leaning forward. When no one stops me, I begin again. And so the novel is structured in such a way that we get the scenes in the hurricane, and then we have Maria Sirena telling her stories. And she reveals to us very early on that as a young woman, she was a lector in a cigar factory in Cuba. And so those of us who know our Cuban history know that the cigar workers, while they rolled the tobacco, there would be a lector, someone sitting sort of like on a lifeguard's chair, who would read the classics to the mainly the men who were working in the factory. And so they would read the classics, newspapers, novels, poems, those kinds of things. And so these workers, though they worked with their hands, were very sort of erudite men. And they one of the favorites of the factory was the Count of Monte Cristo, for example, right? And so she was one of these rare women who got to be a lector, and so she has storytelling gifts, and she reveals very early in the novel as well that she would pretend to read a book and tell her own life story, and made up a name, about who it was, and everyone was sort of riveted by this new novelist, but she was sort of telling her story there. And so the novel, in that sense, it's complex because we have the two scenes, right? The scene in the mansion with the hurricane, and then the scenes in the past. And so I want to read one more scene and then open it up for questions. But this scene is important to me, particularly as a Cuban American, because there's a cameo in the novel of Jose Marti. And so he was a poet and a patriot of that war. And it's very fascinating to me to think of a poet being sort of the hero of a war. Right. The first day he went into battle, he was shot off his horse. He was not a good warrior, of course, it's they say, right? We say he died facing the sun, right? Off of his white horse. Of course, it's a white horse. It's a Gandalf-like horse, and so it's very important to Cuban history. And as a kid growing up here in Miami, my grandmother would make me learn the poems, right? So cultivo una rosa blanca en junio como en enero, right? And I know Los zapaticos de rosa and all of those, right? And they're all Jose Marti poems, and they become part of the fabric of your childhood and of your culture. And so if I was going to write about this war, I was going to make sure Jose Marti made a cameo in it. So he is the poet. The other thing that interests me a lot about Jose Marti and Antonio Maceo and the men who sort of beat the drums of war to break from Spain was that a lot of their planning happened in the United States. A lot of their planning happened in New York City and in Boston, right? And they felt that the revolution, the American Revolution, right, of the 18th century was in the cobblestones in Boston, and that it somehow emotionally spiritually fed the Cuban Revolution, right? And so it's no mistake that the Cuban flag is red, white, and blue, just like the American flag. And I think that that just speaks to the connection between these two countries since the beginning, right? Since the very earliest days. And in fact, Maria Sirena herself was born at sea off the coast of, off the east coast, of the United States. And so in this scene, Maria Sirena is going to tell us a story about being a teenager, quite young, and being in the countryside. Her father, his name is Agustin, and he's one of the rebels. Her mother's name is Iluminada, they call her Lulu, and she is very beautiful and seductive, but also a fighter, and she is fierce. And she wants to fight too, but she can't because she's a woman. No one will let her, okay? And then there's the poet, who Lulu has eyes for. All right. We rode the countryside during the day, sometimes getting into skirmishes with Spanish soldiers. I always knew there would be a fight on the days Agustin led Lulu and me to a stranger's bohío. The country people, who we called guajiros, would let us stay in their house and share their table. More often than not, we ate jutilla and rice. The large rodent's meat was surprisingly juicy, though there was something of the swamp in it, as if I could taste the green muck of the jutilla's home. I could taste something sour, too. Perhaps it was the fear that must have flavored the creature's body at the approach of a caiman, or, in the end, a hunter. On those days, I knew the insurgents would find a narrow passage in the woods where the trees were tightly grouped on either side of a trail and hide, muddying their faces to blend with the forest, and wait in ambush for Spanish soldiers. They always seemed to know where the Spaniards would be, and I guess the guajiros were relaying messages to the insurgents. When Agustin returned for us, he'd be the worse for wear, his skin scraped, his clothes torn, the creases by his eyes caked with mud. But he was alive, and Lulu would embrace him silently, hold his face still as she studied it, and bury her head in his neck. All of this Agustin would endure as stiffly as if my mother had wrapped herself around a statue. He'd thank the guajiros who took care of us, settle us on the mare, and lead us to the next campsite without a word. Once, when Lulu caught me staring at my father on one of those rides through the woods, she told me, "It's a great burden to be a patriot." My expression must have given away some of what I was thinking, that my father's coldness on such days frightened me. Underneath us, the horse would sometimes buck and pull away from Agustin. I sympathized with that creature. The mare had given birth to a sandy-colored foal early that spring. I'd watched the birth in fascination and horror, the horse's flared nostrils, her white, blocky teeth bared, the grunts of her labor, and then the messy slippage of the baby as it slid from her. All of it was burned into my memory. The poor foal died that morning, and the men butchered it for food. Though there was a great swelling of emotion regarding the cause, for the most part the insurgents we rode with were unyielding men who ate the foal with relish, waving pieces of charred meat around a horse's face and laughing. My father joined in on the fun while I watched, refusing food, pulling stinkweed out of the earth with both fists in frustration, for I had wanted to keep the foal for myself, and I'd been the one to discover its stiff little body in the morning, which had been hard on me. The men had laughed at my tears, at my furrowed brow, and Agustin said nothing in my defense. Yet, the poet was of a different sort. On the days when we'd ridden our horses to exhaustion and were forced to camp, the poet isolated himself with sheaves of creamy paper and filled them line after line. Only once did I approach Marti. It was out of boredom, honestly. The others had no interest in me, and more often than not shooed me away. It was a point of contention among our group. Every few days, the insurgents would demand that Lulu and I be taken away for good. Always, Agustin's eyes would flare with anger. Lulu would say something about patriotism and courage, and the poet would raise a slender hand and say, "I'd like them to stay." Why my father wanted us around, even as he seemed to ignore us at every turn, was something I did not understand. As for Marti, his attachment to us was equally mysterious. On the day I spoke with Marti, the first and only time I exchanged words with him, I asked him directly why he came to our defense time and again. The poet did not answer my question, and I wonder now if that's the way with poets. Instead, he redirected me, made me think of other things, occupied my imagination so thoroughly that I forgot what I'd come asking for in the first place. Marti drew a sheet of onion skin paper from his pile. It crinkled prettily as he lifted it, so thin and glossy. The paper reminded me of moth wings. I longed to throw the sheets from a height to watch them flutter down to earth. However, Marti laid the paper over a book he was holding and handed me a carbon pencil. "Do you ever tell stories?" he asked softly, and watched as I made circles and sharp angles in a crescent on the page. When I was done, I'd drawn a giant moth. "It can speak," I told the poet, "and it will answer any question you ask of it. The moth is so large it can carry small children across the island. It chases the moon from one side of Cuba to the other, with children on its back. so that they can enjoy the nighttime without having to sleep. My understanding of astronomy and geography was limited, of course. Cuba was my entire world. And though Lulu told me often of my birth, of how the coast of a place named Georgia could be seen on the starboard side when I was born, I could not yet imagine anywhere but my island. Little storyteller, Marti said, gave me another sheet, and set me on my way. I climbed the nearest tree, folded the page in half, and dropped the paper, quenching my desire to see it fly like a moth. I did this again and again until the page tore on a branch. As for the moth, it was the first story I remember telling. Thank you. So I think that's enough reading. You never want to read too much of these things. But I am happy to answer questions if you have them. Yes.
When writing, Jose Marti, he's such an important part of the Cuban culture.
Yeah.
Was there pressure to, try to do him justice, so to speak?
Sure. And there's, I think, whenever you're writing a real historical figure, there's tremendous pressure. And, there's going to be the Jose Marti, expert in the audience. It's going to be like, and it's going to catch you in that. And so I didn't really feel bold enough to give him more than a cameo, He gets a cameo. But in sort of in my upbringing, sort of hearing about him my whole life, I have a soft spot for him, and I treated him quite delicately. And there's actually a line when that someone mentions that he died, I put in the line that he died facing the sun, right? Because how can I not? I have to, and someone will probably be like, well, he was a horrible blah, 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 and like, I don't want to know. I don't want to know. But really, I just gave him, he lives on the page very briefly in this book, but you have to, he was such a rallying point for the people at the time. And this, particularly the mother, is so fierce and such a revolutionary, that she would have a crush on him. You know what I mean? Like, he would mean a lot to her. Yeah.
So I have a comment and then a question. So I actually just finished teaching a play by a Mexican-American author called Oliver Meyer called Ragged Time, and it's set in 1898. It's about the Spanish-American War, but it has also a child who's orphaned at the center of the story, which I found really interesting about your story. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sort of this wrestling with the archive that has silences in it, and that's what's interesting about it, but also seems like that's what the problem is with it too.
Sure. I'm not the best historian, which I think is why I write fiction and don't write history, history books, because I'd be bad at it, And so I'm not the greatest, person. People go into the archives and are amazing, researchers, and I'm not that person, But whenever you're writing historical fiction, you have to sort of, it's this delicate balance, because you need to read enough and take in enough so that you can write, but not work so much with the material that then you're stymied, because you don't know how to dig into it anymore. And so that's part of, the magic of how it works. You can only do so much history. And so the very first things I found were, again, from the American perspective. It was very difficult to find things from the Cuban perspective. I just didn't find a lot, there. But in a way, not having, as much as I had on the other side of things did free me up to sort of fill in those gaps. Absolutely. Yeah, you're welcome.
So you could write about the hurricane? Was that part of the...
Well, sometimes things are fated and they work out, right? And so I knew it was going to have to be about the era, the Cuban War of Independence. So, but I had 3 decades to play with, But I wanted it sort of close to the end. And so then I said, okay, how old can a person be and still be alive? And remember that, and what year would it have to be? I'm like, the furthest I can push this poor Maria Sirena is like 63. You know what I mean? Like she's old, right, at that point. And so I pushed her as far as I could. And then you go, okay, what happened in the early 60s in Cuba? Like what was happening? And lo and behold, a massive hurricane was happening. At that point, I didn't know. I knew some kind of disaster would be happening to her in the early 60s. I just didn't know what that would be. I was thinking, is it going to be some weird economic thing, a riot? Like what's happening? And history gave me this really terrible storm, actually. And so that worked out, really well. Sometimes you get lucky. I have this huge book. It's called The World Timetable, and I think it ends in 2004, but it's every year of recorded history, right? And it's like this little tiny print, and you just find the year, and it's It's a massive book in this tiny print. It tells you what was happening in all the countries of the world that year. It's great. It's so great. It's my favorite thing. Yeah.
Something about your creative process. You mentioned this book. I'm interested if there's other things you do to kind of create within you the story to get you in the zone. And then a second question, again about the process. Do you hit a writer's wall, and how do you break through?
Okay, so those are two good questions. The first question has to do with what's my process? How do I get into the work? In the main, I do write novels set in particular times in history, right? Like historical fiction in the main. And so I like to work off of things that I've found. So they're articles, or perhaps I'll visit a museum and see an exhibit that just really strikes me or moves me, or I'll see a photograph, and then sort of jump off of that. So usually I have to find a thing, and then I start asking the questions, why and how and who and what, those questions. And then that's how the work starts to build. I don't have like out of the blue lightning bolts of like, the Spanish-American War. Like that doesn't happen. I'll stumble into it in some way, but I think that's true for a lot of us, and it's just about a matter of being sort of perceptive and opening to whatever the universe, that sounds very hoo-hoo woo-woo, but like whatever the universe is going to offer you in terms of material, it's there. In terms of hitting a wall, that absolutely happens, I think when I feel like I've hit a wall, something that's very helpful for me, and this maybe will be helpful for other writers in the room, is giving myself a minimum daily word count. And it's something I borrowed from my friend Ash Parsons, who's a novelist too. And if you give yourself this minimum daily word count, you set it real low, like 500 words, and usually you can blow right past it. And you feel really good about yourself. And on bad days, when all you can get is 500 words, you still feel good about yourself because you hit it, right? And so it's just sort of those motivational things that help you get past it. But if you just sit and stew and say, I just can't, I'm tired, it's hard, then you'll never get it done, So I think the best way to break through writer's block is to actually sit down and write. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, did you write in succession, the chapters, or did you kind of scene it out?
Yes, so the novel that came out in the fall, A Falling Star, I wrote all out of order, and it was the hardest, most horrible, horrific, terrible thing. No, it was hard. Like it's hard to work out of order for me, This book, I wrote it pretty much in order, from beginning to end. The first few sort of months of working on it weren't that smooth. It was sort of writing a few chapters, starting again, writing a few, starting again. No, I knew I need another idea, starting again, doing that thing. But once I knew what the story was, then it was sort of, I knew what the goal was every day, what the characters were going to do next. That doesn't always happen. And I always feel really lucky when my brain lets me do that, but it doesn't always. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's the research that you do with the historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
There's the drafting, and
Yes.
then there's the revision. And so in that wild process, which is your favorite?
My favorite part
and
of the
why?
process. Okay, I have two favorite parts of the process. My first favorite part of the process is the research. It's the research, and that's before you've ever written a word, and you don't know if the idea is actually going to be a book. And I have many projects that I have started and I've researched, and I can tell you so much about Hemingway in Cuba. Not writing that book, I can tell you a lot about just really specific things, and they never became books. The way it never made itself clear to me, but it is fun. And buying books and researching and going to exhibits and traveling, that's a great joy. The other part I like is the revising. Like once the draft is done, and then you're working with an editor or you're working with an agent, and they're telling you, okay, you got stuck here, but I see the way through. Like here's the light, and it feels very like no, because then you're sort of shaping it, you're molding it. It's starting to feel like a thing. And I'm not a solitary person. I know there's that whole myth of the writer in the attic, right? The Emily Dickinson. Well, she did spend a lot of time in an attic, but aside from Emily Dickinson, it's a very collaborative process, and you work with editors, and it's always, that to me is very fun when you can start working with someone on shaping the book. Yeah.
Let me ask you about how do you get to the process? I know when you start, you have a creative idea, and how do you get to the process of the end of the book? Do you have an ending in mind when you start the book?
Not always. not always.
And how do you know when to end the book?
Yeah.
When enough pages
Yeah.
is enough, and your ideas run dry, and you think your creativity is gone.
Yeah, I think with the last two, I knew what the last page was before I even started. And when that happens again, it's great. It's like the brass ring, and you can reach for it, like you can see it. With other projects, either novel length stuff or short stories, I don't know how it's going to end. And that is a little bit more frustrating. You know, you're just sort of going by the seat of your pants. You're letting the characters sort of speak and take you in certain directions. At some point, though, in the drafting of anything, you know what the end is going to be. So you always know the end. It's just the question is, when do you know the end? You know, and so in some projects, you know the end late in the process. And so that those projects always feel they take a little bit longer for me. I meander my way through a bit before I can, before it finally dawns on me, like, oh, that's how it should end. Because you want it to feel inevitable, the end, and surprising but inevitable. And so that's sort of, there's a mystery there to how that happens. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one or two more.
We have plenty of time.
Yeah.
Are you working on another book right now?
Yes, I am, and I don't know the end, and so I'm very frustrated with it. I'm angry at it right now. But it's a 19th century story again. I'm very captivated by the era. There was so much amazing things going on in the world. There was also a moment of American expansion and also American innovation. And it feels like a year like 1898 that you mentioned is just one of those years where everything feels like it's swirling, like a lot is happening in the world. And so the 1890s in general are very sort of vivid to me. So I'm looking at that era again. I'm looking at something set perhaps in the United States, maybe in Spain. But yeah. And Cuba too. You're Cuba. Go back to Cuba. Just go back to Cuba, Chantel. What are you doing? Yeah.
You wrote your first book in 2006. What was it like trying to juggle two books now, since you released one in the fall?
Yes.
And now this?
So I joked earlier today that I look very prolific because one came out in August and one is coming out now. And everybody's got very high expectations, right? But it's a fluke of publishing. The book that came out in August, I wrote a long time ago, actually. And it just took a very long time to place. And this book didn't take as much. And so, they just sort of happened together, which was challenging. It was challenging having them both come out because you want to talk about them with your friends and you want to talk about them on social media and your editors want you to promote. And so it has felt to me like I've been the worst Facebooker all year long because it's just been like me, books, me, It has felt like that, and I hate that. And so I would say if you can avoid not having books within 1 year, I would say that's a good thing. Like to separate them is a good thing. It's been hard, and again, I feel very blessed, and I'm glad that both of them are out in the world. But just to give you a sense of timing, that book that came out in August, I wrote that draft when my daughter, who is now 9, was an infant. That's when I started writing that one. And I have a 3-year-old as well, and this book was written when she was an infant. And so that gives you a sense of the time, and yet they both were born at the same time. These books were born together, and so sometimes publishing can be very weird, like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
That process?
Yeah. And usually there's too many stories. There are too many. Typically, when the writing starts to get really hard, and that's right around page 80, right? Right around page 80, the gloss of it starts to go away, of the new idea. And now you're in the slog, and you're in the middle of the book, which is always the hardest part to write. And that's when, like a magpie, all the other ideas start cropping up. And so you're, working on the one that you're supposed to work on, and suddenly you're like, shiny ideas over here. It's so shiny and distracting. Why don't you look at it for a while? And you're like, and you do that. And so part of the what's helpful is to maybe keep a file of other ideas and or just sort of the feed the need, like maybe buy one book about that research, and sort of feed that need a little bit, but go back to the project because you can work on too many things at once also. Yeah.
Do you have any of those ideas that you would like to share to the audience?
No. No. There's so many. Yeah. No, I think no. Because I think there's a danger to it, and you can talk a thing to death. And because I think the act, I think as a writer, I think anyone who writes or produces stories, even if you're writing for television or whatever, I think there's a kind of urgency to the writing. Like, I have to get this down. You know, it keeps you up at night. But if you start telling it too much, then you don't have the urgency anymore. It's like, you told it. You know, like, I think that's real. You exhausted it. And that's happened to me before with that Hemingway book I mentioned. I told everybody about this book. It was going to be good. It was about Hemingway's lost manuscript. Someone else should write it. But I did so much research. I talked about it so much that when I went down to sit down, I had about 50 pages. I was like, I'm done. I told you. It was a good story. Did you enjoy it? Yeah. You know? And there's something about that. You can ruin your own projects by talking about them. And that's not like being weird. It's happened to me in the past. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between your teaching and writing. Like, do they feed each other in some way, or do you feel like it's better to keep them separate?
They totally can feed each other. I think it's about framing it in your own head, you know, because I think on some days when there's a lot of grading to do, you feel like this is killing my soul, right? And I will never write again. And, you know, like you just feel, you know, that you're being slogged down, you know. But sometimes I think it's if you frame it differently, you know, if I'm I'm struggling with a particular craft issue, I can bring that to the class and say, okay, guys, how do I tell a story in first person from, you know, and I might do an assignment with them and we'll write together. And suddenly, sometimes the answer is clear in trying to just hash it out, you know, or even, or students might even be, you know, they're great. And they might say, you know what book does that? And they'll like point me towards some like weird fantasy novel, and it will be completely out of my wheelhouse. And then I'll pick it up and it'll solve the problem for me, right? Like, that's how you do it, you know? So sometimes, again, it's just reframing it in your head. And I have been able to live very comfortably as writer and teacher together, you know. But yeah, there are bad days. There are days where I'm like, these short stories, I don't want to read another one. Like, you know, and you're there, and you have to sort of shake out of it, you know, because I was a student too at the great University of Miami. Yeah. And I'm sure my teachers were like, oh God, you know, Chantel stories, you know, but, you know, I was so grateful, you know, to those teachers who took their time with me. Right. So I think it's good to return you know, to give it back, you know, to give it back. So. Yeah.
Do you have any plans in writing a book geared towards the teenage audience?
You know, yes. The young adult, you know, stuff right now is explosive. You know, it's everyone's, you know, reading YA and writing YA. I think adults are reading a lot of YA. I think a lot of that has to do with because they're very plot driven, you know, and so I think we have a need for just story. Just give me a story, you know, and I think there's a lot of that, you know, in young adult. I also happen to have some very dear friends, you know, who live in town in Auburn, and they're young adult authors, so I feel very much sort of in their world, and they seem to have a lot of fun, I think. But yeah, there's an idea in the folder as well, you know, but it's very different from sort of the literary publishing world. They're very different beasts, but yeah, maybe someday. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much.
All right, then, if there are no more questions, a note to our internet audience watching at home. Still plenty of time for you to pick up a copy of tonight's book, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there, as well as Chantel's previous titles. She'll be signing over here at the table to the left of the podium. I want to thank Evelina Galang for doing our introduction tonight, and please give another big hand to our friend Chantel Acevedo. Thank you very much.